It is one of the best kept secrets in the psychedelic world that you all exist in Utah. The news is out. And although I'm going to frame, this evening is kind of frame, little Chinese boxes, transpersonal psychology, psychedelic renaissance, microdosing. But since I know more about microdosing than those other things, I'm going to spend more time there. And I wanted to start with a couple of kind of light microdosing items. We'll get heavier later on. But this is the man in the street, you know, the questions you get asked, you know, like what's your favorite hobby, and you know, those things that you read in the newspaper. And in the Santa Cruz, California newspaper is, what do you think of microdosing? Microdosing can be a very useful tool for the creative outlet and a way to become more conscious. I find it helps me to open to the world in a little more safe, gradual way. I think it might be extremely useful if you're open to such things, which he's not. When done with clear intention, it's a worthwhile experience. That was a yoga massage dance teacher. I think it's important, and it's a way for people to understand themselves a little bit deeper than they can without it. I think it helped me a lot. So we're going to get there, but I also just wanted to give you I get a lot of interesting email and people that I'll never meet who I like. Hi, James. I've always been a driven individual, and with that, anxieties become a daily nuisance. With success comes a consequence, and I've lived with anxiety for over 10 years. Since I started microdosing 6 months ago, my productivity increased immensely, my strategic thinking has been unleashed, and I no longer lose sleep over my clients. I've just been recognized at my company for having the highest financial success for my client base. Clearly, I can't advertise why I feel my production level has reached these levels. But I know why. And that's all that matters. Let me take it back even a little wider than transpersonal to the Hippocratic Oath. The Hippocratic Oath is not about hypocrisy, it's about Hippocrates. And somewhere between 500 and 300 BC, he developed an oath for people doing healing. And it was what a physician would like swear by, to be kind of sworn in as a physician. And you swear by the various gods and goddesses, and there's a pretty long list. Quite a lot of things, including no sex with clients, keeping their secrets. But there's one that most people remember or think they do called first do no harm. And you may have heard that. What's wonderful about scholarship is it's not at all in the Hippocratic Oath, it has nothing to do with it. It appears for the first time in the 17th century to a French physician. And there's a version of it that happened 100 years later called either help or do not harm the patient. Now, whether modern medicine is still doing that, we could argue, but that's a very high goal, is to either help or do not harm. That's too high a bar for me. So I'm going to settle, if we can this evening, if I can do a little good, that'll be enough. There were two psychologies for quite a while, psychoanalytic, which suggests that people deeply are immoral. and need to control their lust, their rage, their anger, their selfishness. And there was another psychology called behaviorism, which said people are not immoral. They have no morality at all. They're amoral. They simply react to the outside world. And they react in ways that are very predictable. And as science was kind of becoming a dominant religious system, behaviorism said people, after all, are among the animals. They're animals in many ways. So let's study animals. And since it's hard to do the things to people that you can do to animals, in fact, we'll just study animals and we'll just generalize to people. And if you went to universities, those would be the two schools. And at some point, and both were very popular. And the behaviorists are currently popular. It's now called cognitive behavioral, because they finally had to admit there were thoughts. And cognitive behavioral people will teach you how to behave, how to install new habits, including habits of thought. And that's proved to be very useful. Does it tell you much about consciousness? No, but as a mechanical system, it's not so bad. And however, a lot of people in the psychology and psychiatry world felt this was awfully inadequate way to describe something interesting, namely us. So humanistic psychology, which was a total reaction against these two, emerged, and it said people are moral, and they actually wish good, and they wish good for others. And if you approach human beings that way, where it isn't about lust and dominance, but it's about love and nurturance, you come up with a very different, not only psychology, but a different view of the human being. And a different way of understanding either the world or how it could be. And the humanistic people were very clear that people were separate. You know, if you look at the person next to you, there's some space between you. A little bit of air, or maybe if you're a little closer, a little bit of cloth. And if you're a little closer, I'm not discussing you. Not only were people somewhat separate, they could be very intimate with each other, I, thou. But also, religious and spiritual systems were probably bunk or worse. And in this way, they were in total agreement with both the behaviorists and the psychoanalysts. And not only with religious and spiritual systems, but there were no other beings, there were no other levels of reality. Kind of what you see is what you get. Transpersonal arose as a reaction against everybody else. And they said we're not only not immoral, not amoral, and not merely moral, but consciousness is bigger than your personality. And in so thinking about that, they came up with the notion that there was more to you than your personal identity. More to you than your unconscious, whatever that was. And then as transpersonal, merely kind of arguing within psychology, started looking around for friends, they noticed that the major spiritual systems had thought about that for a couple of thousand years and really were very sophisticated. So suddenly psychology, which is not very sophisticated at its best, had heir to these thousands of years of thought. From India, predominantly from Buddhism, which really thinks about thinking, and then from shamanism and indigenous people. And early on, just the way history works itself out, the people involved in the transpersonal psychology movement, as it might be called, were also trying to figure out their own psychedelic experiences. And if you look at the history of transpersonal, one of the people who says that he was the kind of creator of transpersonal is Stan Grof, whose name many of you know. And the other was the group who did it, who were all friends with Stan, of which I was one. And actually, so transpersonal then suddenly was a psychology of all of human consciousness. Not only, if you kind of make a normal curve, which you can do with most everything, height, weight, so forth, clinical psychology tended to be, which was psychoanalytic and a lot of behaviorists, from healthy on down. And more pathology was described better and better. Transpersonal said, hey, what about this other half? Isn't it probably more interesting and maybe more useful to look at the best of human beings in the best situations? So what can we learn from the great artists, from the great philosophers, from the great athletes, from the great inventors, and, not surprisingly, from the great spiritual beings? So you had a psychology which suddenly took in the full span, but spent more time over here kind of in the sunlight. And at the same time, most of psychology was trying to be scientific, kind of like the big kids. You know, you're in a university and you see who gets the new buildings. Well, that 7-story building is the philosophy department. No, that's chemistry. Well, how about that one? It's religious studies? No, that's physics. How about that little crappy building that used to be a tool shed? Yeah, that's psychology. Well, we'd like to, psychologists wanted to migrate across campus and be with the big kids. So they became more and more scientific, which made them not like transpersonal at all. Because the one thing we know about the full span of human consciousness is statistics isn't a good method. Prayer, meditation, drugs, but not statistics. And then the transpersonal also began to, at the same time, all the translations from Sanskrit and from the Buddhist texts and also from indigenous people were becoming visible. And so it looked like there was this incredible web of transpersonal thought, and in many cultures fueled by psychedelic use, that suddenly had a place without arguing about each other. So this wasn't one religious system against another, but what was in common with spiritual systems. Okay? Now, we then move into psychedelics. Now, I'm probably going to distress somebody here. But did any of you study Mormon history? Not so many. Does anybody know who Frederick Smith was? Okay, yes?
Was Joseph's grandfather?
Yep, he was the grandson of Joseph Smith. Now, what do you know about his psychedelic habits?
All I know is
It didn't cover that?
I'm pretty sure.
Okay, I'll fill you in, because even though I'm a visitor, Mormon history is endlessly fascinating. By the way, notice what you can do with even a very small pause. It's a famous pause in literature. It's Jack Benny, who is a comic known to be very, very stingy. And he's in an alley, and he's being held up by a robber. And the robber says, "Your money or your life?" And there's this long pause. And the robber says, "I said your money or your life." And Jack Benny says, I'm thinking. So it's one of the great pauses of literature. Okay, in 1915, Frederick Madison Smith spoke to his followers about the peyote ceremony of the Plains Indians. it became a regular theme in his calls to renew the Mormon faith. He described the ceremonies about the particular and ecstatic sense generated by the ceremonies with their beautiful visions and their wonderful and beneficial therapeutic effects that followed. He then talked about that they were a potent stimulus to the elusive state of genuine religious ecstasy, and that he himself had taken it in all-night rituals with Indian tribes, including the Omaha and the Cheyenne. Now, is that, everybody was taught that? Well, Frederick got very interested, as some of you have, in psychology out of these experiences, and he actually worked under William James. And he was one of the very few voices standing up for the Indians' right for their own religions. But he promoted peyote in non-Indian circles, and this is the story that I love. His wife, Ruth, had joined him in peyote meetings and in 1918. And when his daughter, Alice, went to Harvard the following year, Smith introduced the cactus to her classmates. So he went to Harvard and gave them psychedelic drugs. Tim and Dick, Ram Dass and Tim Leary would have been so excited to have known this while they were being fired. After dinner, he described its effects to her friend Virgil Thompson, who was already a talented musician, became a famous American composer. He tripped and described a series of rapturous visions, each as complete in color and texture as a stage set. Each one, however, had a meaning. In some, they constituted a view of life, not merely picturesque, but vast, but all mine, he says, and all true. So I'd like to just take a moment to thank Mr. Smith for being the original Utah psychedelic evangelist, of which many of you are the descendants. And in case that upsets you, I won't tell you where I'm staying or when I leave town. But I love that. Now, there's a term out there in the larger psychedelic world called the psychedelic renaissance. Now, the real renaissance was the rediscovery of Roman and Greek science, art, literature, philosophy, poetry. It's a kind of hype to call the psychedelic Renaissance. It's really that we were allowed after 40 years, maybe giving a metaphor, wandering in the desert just as a metaphor, allowed back in to continue the work we'd been doing. And the year that psychedelics were made what was called Schedule 1, which means having no possible medical use and a high possibility of addiction, that was the same year when LSD was the most researched psychiatric drug on the planet. And when I first entered this psychedelic world in the early 60s, I wrote Sandoz, the pharmaceutical company, and said, can you send me any papers, any literature? I'm a graduate student, that's what we do. I got 2 volumes only of abstracts, and it was only the first 1,000 papers. Okay, so that's what it was when it went under Schedule 1. And Schedule 1, the use of both marijuana and psychedelics never, this is another bit of history, had anything to do with science or medicine. According to Ehrlichman, who was a colleague of Nixon's when they were both all being busted, It never had anything to do with the drugs. It was a method that they came up with to pass laws against drugs most used by Nixon, the people that Nixon hated the most, who happened to be hippies and blacks. He could investigate them, he could break up their meetings, he could spy on them, he could do all kinds of things. And that's how Schedule I drugs, silly drugs ones that are obviously medically valuable, came into the situation. So the Renaissance was simply a removal of the non-scientific part. And because scientists are the way they are, they had built up over the years all kinds of theories of why they were Schedule I, none of which were true, but scientists are really good at theories. They're nice people. I don't know if you'd want your daughter to marry one, but they're nice people. And they love making theories, and then they make counter theories, and they write journals and so forth. So there was a whole notion of why psychedelics were illegal. Now, it turned out that a great many, like you, checked it out. And it turns out, this is now the government figures, which has to be on the low side, since psychedelics were made illegal, 27 million Americans, just Americans, have taken LSD. Now, I'm not mentioning MDMA. Now, if we get to marijuana, by the way, the figure goes up to like 141 million. So making things illegal changes their distribution pattern. That's about all I can say about it. I mean, it may raise the price as well, but. So when psychedelics came back, there was an enormous amount of no resistance. And they came back very carefully and very strategically. There was some of you have read a book by Michael Pollan, and he describes a secret meeting at Esalen Institute on the coast, California coast, where people from government and people from the universities and people related to the psychedelic underworld met for a weekend to lay out a strategy and to come up with a series of goals of how psychedelics could be returned into the mainstream of science, medicine, and personal spiritual use. One of the goals was to have a major prestigious university do one impeccable study that met every scientific restriction you could imagine. And as Michael Pollan's book describes it, in 2006, that study came out of Johns Hopkins, and from that, lots of nice things have happened. And lots of nice things are continuing to happen because psychedelics in high doses are remarkable. Now, let me just ask you a question. How many of you have not used a psychedelic? Not used a psychedelic? It's okay, a couple of you that are there. Nothing's going to happen to you. But whoever brought you, okay, that's what happened during the years when it was illegal, okay? You. Okay? So it was not surprising that the Renaissance has gone on without much fuss. I mean, one of the huge cultural shifts is no media backlash, no scare articles, no fear articles, no God will smite you articles, which were quite popular in the 60s. One of the reasons, having now dealt with many, many, many journalists, is it's very hard to find a journalist that hasn't had psychedelic experience. They are curious people, meaning people with curiosity. So this return of psychedelic medicine and psychology and spirituality has had, I mean, that's really was the most startling when in my little career where I've been called bad names by nice people. here was bad people calling me nice names. And the fact of your turning out in this number is not, it's not a total surprise, but it's a wonderful one. Because what I'm seeing is every time in various parts of the country, someone says, let's have a psychedelic something, a meetup, a discussion, an evening, it's packed. Because the hunger to understand what has gone on for you and the pleasure in being with each other are very important. And there's a film, I don't know if it's come to Salt Lake City yet, Fabulous Fungi? Yeah, you bet. And the people distributing that film have said, we're only showing it in theaters. Whoop! Not streaming, not Netflix, not something I can do at home late at night. And they said, no, we want people to come to theaters for two reasons. Actually, for one reason. It brings together the community. And the community can see that it's a community. So that one of the things that has happened in the psychedelic renaissance is it's giving permission for people, other than people like me who say it anyway, but to say to other people, last week, I dropped mushrooms and I saw the most amazing thing. And I feel so much better. Okay? So what happens then in the practical world, in the sciencey world, in the business world? Stage one is research. Stage two is kind of making it legal in some restricted way. And right now what's happening is the vultures of capitalism have discovered psychedelics. And the money is pouring in. Unfortunately, I'm not in the right place yet. I keep going around. But what also happened is a few years ago, a listserv, that's a list in which people can talk to each other online, for people in the graduate programs who were interested enough in psychedelics to have come out in their institution. They'd written a paper, they'd published, they were talking about research. They weren't just covert users. That list has hundreds and hundreds of graduate students from dozens of fields, not just psychiatry, psychology, neuroscience, from a great many countries, and they just help each other. Someone says, I'm trying to find this, this paper that was only written in Czechoslovakian. And someone else writes in, I have it. I'll run it through a translator and send it to you. Like, just again, a cooperative community. Stanford, who has tried to avoid psychedelics as much as they possibly could for decades, a second-year psychiatry student wanted to offer a class in psychedelic medicine. And he finally got permission, he got a professor, and he was offered a class that could hold 30. The class just started last week with 150. Because they're like you. So, what we're now in the research side is that the new game is research centers happening. There's a center in Royal College of London, a center of psychedelic studies. The taboo, the denied, the evil, the Schedule 1. John Hopkins was given $17 million, and academic institutions are so liberal when they get a lot of money. I mean, I suddenly read a press release from Hopkins and I thought, whoa, what happened? And I read down to the middle and said, we just got $17 million. And what then happens is Columbia wants to have one. And I just actually was talking about Stanford, and their psychiatric department is very interested because there's a for-profit company that would put a couple of $1 million into research projects. So I don't underestimate the shift in the culture from greed. If you look at the marijuana situation, I'm not saying it's being run well or badly, but it certainly suddenly money changed it. So there we are. And why did we start with science? Why did we pick a hard science research project to open up psychedelics again? Mainly because science and medicine are the dominant religious positions in our age. It didn't used to be that way. The dominant position used to be personal experience. The great religious traditions, of which Mormonism is one, was about an individual having an experience. Zoroaster, Buddha, Jesus in the desert, Muhammad, Joseph Smith, saints, prophets. Just consider, that was the best possible source of information, is what somebody told you about, and this is not probably the best word for it, but their trip. So it's, as someone who is just kind of watching culture go by, we now say, we used to say it must be true because look what happened to these people after they had their revelations. Look at how magnetic they are and how amazing and how people believe in them. There has to be truth in that. Now we say it's true because there was a double-blind study with a statistically significant difference between the control group. And there's a trick in there. The word, it's one of those great marketing tools. Statistically significant difference. Significant, what's that mean? That means, wow, something special. That's not what it means at all in science. It's just a number. And when you, and it also doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything what we call real difference. You know, here's an antidepressant, and here's another antidepressant, a new one. And it's statistically significantly different and better. How much better? 2%. Over for some of you with science, over 5,000 people. Which means it is such a tiny difference in reality that no one would notice it. That's called significant. So when you're reading science, watch out for that. It usually means that they didn't have a real result. That they could say, look, the person's arm got better. Right? You don't need a statistically significant difference. But there's another kind of science called folk science or citizen science where you have lots more freedom to do research or search. So what we now have is the scientific world is kind of signing off on psychedelics. And the business world is moving in and they say, this has been statistically proved to be something, and we're selling it for a lot. And hopefully we're going to sell it through the scientific model because we've learned that we can charge a fortune if it's a medicine. And we can't if it's a supplement or an herb or a naturally occurring substance. So just be aware of just some of the mechanics that we're in. MDMA, which had a history of being just really fun, especially if you wanted to dance all night and have everyone like you and you like everyone. At least that tells me about what you did in high school. Until then it became Schedule 1. But it was actually being used for therapy with couples. Because again, as you know from using MDMA, you can really talk about anything without getting freaked out, without being triggered. And so it's now being used for very, very heavy serious problems. But what we're seeing is a return of MDMA through the medical route, not through the social route. Now, ketamine, how many of you have tried ketamine? Okay. That's ketamine. I assume you know it's an anesthetic for animals. It's already out as a medicine, as an anesthetic, and actually it's used for people a lot. But it turns out if you change the dose level and so forth, as many of you can tell the rest of you, it has other effects. Again, look at the popular press, and even when people really freak out on MDMA, and there have been deaths at raves, almost always from people misusing, not MDMA, but misusing things like water. Even though there are deaths, it continues to become useful and used because it's come through science. So the Renaissance is on. There's, as I say, hundreds of graduate students wanting in. There are hundreds of professionals who already have licenses wanting to change what they're doing. And that's all happening. And it turns out, which I wouldn't have said when I prepared this because I was in California, there's a lot going on in Utah. Not under the table, that's your stuff. Over the, whatever we call it, over the table, on the table, not using a table at all. At clinics, at hospitals, and at universities, using psychedelics, a lot of it being ketamine, in really the best possible ways. So things are moving much faster than I imagine, and I think I try and keep up. I'm supposed to. So you're in a wonderful time in this state, in this city, to become part of the psychedelic renaissance in a very positive way. Now, microdosing, if I can say this in a kind of shabby literary way, while great things were going on in the big world, in the Shire, the hobbits were living a very quiet life with small pleasures. Welcome to the quiet world of microdosing. Hoffman talked about taking low doses and that there had been no research in that area. And he said at one point, had Sandoz, his company, researched low doses, there would never have been a market for Ritalin. Ritalin, Adderall, Provigil, that whole family of just stimulants. He mentioned, he actually took higher doses than microdosing. And at one point he mentioned it to the head of MAPS, who said, and I found this wonderful little bit of dialogue, where Rick Dobbins said, "You don't mean that 10 micrograms would have an effect?" And Hoffman basically says, "You should try it." It's very nice. And nothing happened. And then I ran into a friend who had also been friends with Hoffman, who said it was a good idea. And I got curious, and that was the last 10 years of my life. But again, let me then take you into the world of microdosing out of my mailbox. This is actually from Reddit. There's a sub-edit on Reddit. Oh, that's a marvelous way of speaking, isn't it? If I were high, I'd start saying it and saying it and saying it. And we would all chant it, and but this is a serious evening. Okay. The Reddit subreddit has about 70,000 people on it. Okay. So microdosing is out there. Before I started microdosing shrooms, I was 250 pounds, deeply depressed, and a joke of a man. 1 year later, I'm a 180-pound elite calisthenics athlete. My baseline mood is a couple of notches higher. My productivity is up. My panic attacks and anxiety are gone. My life is changed through and through. Someone else responds, same here. I have about 10 that grow in my garden every autumn. I microdose the 10 throughout the year. And someone else whose name is Hidden Harvest Grow Lights says, same. Depression and addiction constantly gnawing away. The microdose makes things amazing. I still do the hard work by constantly working on myself, but the micro helps even the playing field. Blessings on you both. That's Reddit. This is someone else saying, I want to share my experiences so other people can understand. How many of you are in college or something like that? Okay. During my last semester, a friend of mine was able to get a tab of LSD. I did volumetric dosing, that's putting it in water and measuring the water. And I cannot understate how good it really was for attaining a strong flow state. My test anxiety evaporated. But more than that, I had a command of my faculties that I'd not experienced before or since. During some particularly difficult 9 days, when I had 6 exams, I found myself performing at the top of my game. I managed to get an A on 5 out of 6. That was from 3 doses of 10 mics spread over the 9-day period. Hard problems became doable, and then in caps, and fun. My spatial capacities increased several-fold. I hesitate to say it made me smarter. It definitely made me more competent and capable. Imagine being really good at honing a sword edge, but being a terrible swordsman. This is like being able to wield a sword with efficiency and effectiveness. This is out of Reddit, so go for it, brother. I've been microdosing for 6 months and my life has greatly improved in almost every aspect. Dressing better. Did you hear that, Mom? Your kid's not dressing well? Way more social, which has helped me get out of my bubble and expand my social circle. Way more empathic and loving. I could go on and on. Take the plunge. You won't regret it. And one more. This is an article in an arts magazine in the Hudson Valley. And this is someone who has Lyme, L-O-I-M-E. It's a bacterial problem that can affect every organ system. And it doesn't do well with a lot of modern medicine. I've tried everything, holistic treatments, diet changes, exercise, personal training to get back some strength. I was doing all this hard work and still having really bad days of inflammation and exhaustion. I was frustrated, and obviously you get depressed because it all adds up. This is the writer of the article, about 2 years ago, heard about microdosing. Exponentially more subtle, microdosing is very different than tripping and generally adds like a good mood enhancer. Psychedelics are illegal, making access tricky, but after the source, she then finds out that after embarking on some other big efforts to feel better, including a ketogenic diet, for those of you doing that, I feel like I had space to add this other element. And honestly, from day one, it completely changed everything. I stopped having bad days physically and mentally. She had dreamed of hiking and swimming in the places near her home in the Hudson Valley, but had been too exhausted until now. Quote from her: "The day after I started microdosing, I would hop out of bed in the morning early to go hike and swim. I felt energized. I was living my fantasy." Now, when you look at those, you say, there is something here to consider. You might say, if you're in the science world, it could be a placebo. A placebo, by the way, placebo reaction, that's when you take sugar water and you're told it's a stimulant and you feel terrific. Or you're told it's a sleeping pill, same sugar, and you get really sleepy. That's placebo reaction. It really means the natural healing response. It's the body's capacity to do remarkable things if it's suggested. And if microdoses are a placebo, they are the most effective placebo we've ever discovered. Now, what we did, we being my smart woman partner who knows all things like mathematics, statistics, and all the things that I don't, because I have a PhD in psychology. We ended up getting several thousand reports of people like the reports I'm reading to you. And they're all on these Excel spreadsheets, and some of you know how to print out an Excel spreadsheet that's like 3.5 pages wide. I don't. But I was just trying to get a sample to show you what we're finding this is from 51 countries. And this is just a slice of their comment. "I had low energy since I can remember, and it appears so far," someone else. "No fog, but I feel flat, dull, disinterested, but I'll stay the course," someone else. "Increased sense of humor, increased awareness, enjoyment." Here's another one. "Public and can talk better with people I don't have a strong connection to." Here's another. "Self-awareness and mindfulness, less swings in mood." Here's another. All the benefits I've read about. More clarity in the thinking process and improved, combining. Some days it feels like a significant effect. General mood uplift followed through over eye. We're getting little slices of people's lives. And what we're finding is there's something going on with microdosing that is worth looking at. And we call it search. Search is when you're trying to find out stuff in the world. Research is usually when you're trying to prove something, you kind of know what you're going for. Because when you do a research study, you usually have all kinds of limitations on who can be in it, so that you're most likely to find what you want to find. Now, that's not being bad, that's just the way it is. Search is when anything goes because you don't know what you're looking for. Columbus tended to search. He said, it's out there somewhere, I don't know what it is or where it is, but it's kind of that direction. Later on, people said, I want to go to South America, I think I'll go to, try New England. I mean, they kind of knew where they were going. And it was a very different kind of situation. We've been involved in search for years. And because of that, we get all these wonderful discoveries. Now, a lot of you know a lot about psychedelics. And I'm going to give you one of my favorite, I don't know anything that makes sense about this at all. And the story has a couple of levels, which is I get an email, hello, you don't know me. One of the reasons you don't know me is I'm in Zambia. And I think, as you do, where is Zambia? Please, God, don't let me, don't have anyone ask me, because I know it's kind of in Africa and it probably doesn't have a coastline. It actually has a desert in the back called the Kalahari Desert. And he writes that he's had shingles. Now, shingles is a painful disease, painful experience of often middle age and up for people that have had chickenpox. The notion from the medical world is the virus, which many of you had as chickenpox, kind of retreats somewhere and hides till middle age, and then it comes out and causes enormous upset and pain if you don't take care of it, predominantly in your middle. Okay? Nerve damage, acute pain. Now there is something, if you catch it early, that handles it for most people, but about 7% of people have really terrible experiences. And then when you look up what's the treatment, there's 9 different treatments. Now what you know in medicine, if there's 9 treatments, that they don't work well. Just kind of straightforward. So this guy writes me, and I'm getting this letter about how awful his shingles are. He didn't have any treatment, and how terrible and how painful. And he said, I'm at the place where I can no longer sleep because any position I'm in has such acute pain. No psychedelic experience. Somehow, he says, I had friends in the capital of Zambia, extra credit if you know what it is, way extra credit, who had mushrooms. So he took some. Not some, but some. 45 minutes later, I was out of pain. Okay? See, the reason I like that is I haven't the faintest idea what could have possibly happened. Okay? And I like sharing it with physicians. Because you watch them go through what I've just talked about, as the nerve, the chickenpox, and there's nothing in the psychedelic literature, there's nothing in the indigenous literature, there's nothing in the spiritual literature that says if you get shingles, it can be helped with a microdose. So I'm really excited because that's what turns me on. I love stuff that just blows my theory out of the water. So I call my colleague Sophia. You know, I've got really this great story. I'm going to be, you know, she's going to think I'm cool, you know, the whole thing. And she's just been in Prague at an international psychedelic conference. And I say, I got this great thing. And I say, shingles. She said, funny you should bring it up. And I'm waiting. She says, your money, no. She says, while I was in Prague at the conference, 2 different women came up, threw their arms around me and wept. I said, yeah? She said, shingles. Their husbands had somehow, again, so we have a little sub-study called shingles, about 8 people. What we want to do is find someone who's a shingles researcher and say, it's yours. Because that's what exploration is about. You explore, you find something, you find someone who's interested in that. You know, I have a daughter who's an ethnobotanist, and when you're a botanist, you go to some unusual place and you get to discover species. And unlike the double-blind controlled study kind of science, if you find one, that counts. You know, I found one fish with a red cone coming out of his head. That means there's those fish out there. So when we make a discovery in microdosing, those are some of the fish we find. Now, let me be at least pseudoscientific, so if some of you like science are not totally disappointed. Here's a list of reported benefits. Now, this is a list a couple of years back, and if I made this list today, it would just be a lot longer. But you'll get the idea of why microdosing is so interesting from an exploration point of view, and a little hard from a science point of view. Because medical science has gotten more and more, the smaller the symptom, you know, the singular disease, the singular organ, that's kind of where the excitement is. What is microdosing reported to be good for? Anxiety, general, social anxiety, academic, Let me give you what social anxiety is like. College sophomore, she said, I made an experiment with my social anxiety. If I go to Target late at night, I will not make eye contact and it'll take me forever to make a purchase. What happened is I was making eye contact with people and talking, and I made my purchases easily. I didn't have my social anxiety. And we have lots of those. Asperger's, that's high functioning autism. More ease in social situations. The problem with people with high functioning Asperger's, really means also very high IQ usually, is they don't notice social cues. They don't notice changes in tone or eyebrow movement, and therefore they're kind of clueless and have a very hard time socially, some of them. Microdosing seems to be very helpful. Depression. When people sign up, take microdoses for depression, usually they're what are called treatment-resistant depression, which they've already tried a bunch of stuff. And it's remarkably successful. We've got about maybe an 80-85% success rate. Now this is with people who are running a 0 success rate with the medications they're on. So they're not just your general depressed people. One of my favorites is no post-Burning Man crash. Now that's, and you just can't go to a regular practitioner with that one. More creativity, coding, machine design. People change. Now this was one that was another surprise. It's kind of not as exciting as shingles. But when people make changes in their lives that they didn't intend to make by microdosing, then you pay attention. And what we got is people change their health habits. They tend to eat better in the conventional sense of, fresh and wholesome and not processed and all that. They also tend to make less cigarettes, less coffee, less Adderall, and less marijuana. The reasoning when they say so is I didn't feel the need for it. A lot of very heavy whatever we call awful psychological medications, which are very, very, very hard to get off of, even if they are total failures. People have found it's much easier to taper off them using a microdose. Insights, some. Improved learning, improved academic learning. And it's one of the things that I like to kind of worry people with, which is it looks like if you took a class of people who were all getting, say, B's in the class, and you gave this group microdoses and this group not, the one group that you microdosed would have a higher grade point average. Now this suggests a significant social issue that the academic world is not equipped to deal with. Now why do I say it's not equipped to deal with if it hasn't happened yet? Because it has happened. How many of you know what Adderall is? How do you know? Okay. Adderall is, according to a lot of studies, the second most, now you'll see what the study's like, the second most abused drug on campus after marijuana. Now the problem with Adderall is it's addictive, you crash, and it has a lot of awful side effects, but it does give you energy to pull an all-nighter. Microdosing just seems to allow you to study better, remember PowerPoints more easily, and that I read you the college remark, which is you function better. That's very different. Migraines, how many of you have ever had a migraine? Whoa. Well, it turns out for people that have migraines, they will tend to have less. Lots less. I got a letter from a woman, actually the wife of a holistic physician, and what she said is, I kind of wrote a "How are you?" and she said, "I had a migraine last month that lasted, 36 hours." And I wrote, "I'm really sorry, da da da." She wrote back and said, "Don't worry about it. I used to have 20 a month." What's going on? Well, since we don't know what causes migraines, it's hard to say why microdosing would help. Menstrual periods. Again, like not as fun as the Zambia, but I get a letter that says, "Hi, Dr. Fadiman." When someone doctors me, I know that they want something. Or they did something bad. She was more in the latter. She said, "I know I owe you a report." This was a art historian living in London. She said, "But I thought this might interest you. During the month I microdosed," which is what we ask people to do in our study. I had my period, and for the first time in my life, it was normal. And I thought, I don't care about your report, but whoa, what's going on? So I wrote her kind of a pseudo-scientific letter that said, what are you taking? How much are you taking? And how often are you taking it? And what are you doing every month? And she wrote back and she said, "I'm not doing anything. I took it during that month, and I don't microdose now. My periods are normal. You have changed my life. Thank you." So we have a little sub-study of those, of other women who've written in with changes in menstrual difficulties, both psychological, emotional, and physical. And one that's a little tricky, and I'll end with that one, it's procrastination. Now, when you procrastinate, what it is the thing that you're not doing has something attached to it that you don't want to think about or do, right? I used to, when I was teaching people about affirmations and goal setting and so forth, I said, "Is there something in your garage that you haven't fixed that's on a shelf? And how long has it been there? A week, a month, 8 years?" And then I would say, "How long is it going to take you to fix it? 10 minutes? Okay? So procrastination just exists. It turns out with microdosing, lots and lots and lots of people say, "I no longer procrastinate." And I thought, that's really wonderful. I like that. The human race is improved. Suffering is minimized. Buddhists will like me. And then I thought, uh-oh. What if the pharmaceutical industry now will think that because procrastination can be alleviated, it's a disease? They can have a drug for it. If any of you are with the pharmaceutical industry, just don't talk about this. And then turns out that microdosing is extremely good for first drafts of writing. And part of the research on this is there's been a lot of media and a lot of people have interviewed us over the years, and I mentioned to journalists that I've been told by other journalists that it's good for first drafts. And then I will get a letter a week later saying, yes, it is. So what's happening? Here we go. Now when I say microdosing psychedelics, I'm talking LSD, psilocybin, something called 1P-LSD, and if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't worry about it. Mescaline, which synthetic mescaline is very rare. Peyote. There's several cactuses with mescaline. Oh, you can by the way, the cactuses that have mescaline. If you're really into illegal activities, you can buy them on Amazon. You can also buy morning glory seeds on Amazon, which have something called lysergic acid amide. Lysergic acid diethylamide is LSD. It's about 1/100th as strong. And when I was doing my research of how many psychedelics could I buy on Amazon, it's hard to do a double-blind study. But I was looking at morning glory seeds, and there were two companies that sold the particular, there's several species of morning glory seeds, and I will not tell you those. But one, you read the reviews, and one said, this is a wonderful color. I used it on the back fence and so forth. I put it between the rows and said, it's so beautiful. And the other company, it says, man, this is really good stuff. So there are people out there who think morning glory seeds are what you grow morning glories from. And then there's more like us. Well, we're now in a different phase in that, remember I talked about money coming in. Psychedelics is now the hot money property. And they've got a great term for it. You watch, there are two great terms. One is, it's now the shroom boom. And according to the last thing, I can't prepare too far in advance because last night there was two articles. One said there's $200 million that have been invested in psychedelic enterprises. That's 199.5 million more than had been up till now. And the other said that I won't tell you about the other one. No, because you might get excited. But it's the federal government. And they don't quite know what they're doing yet, and I probably will not write them. But I wanted to finish, and then I want to have hopefully time for questions. I want to finish, remember we began with that kind of cheerful guy that said, I'm making more money and I won't tell my company how. And that's a lovely way of using microdosing. I want to finish with someone, again, who wrote us from Australia. And what she said was she'd been suicidal. She was under the care of a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist. And she described her life, and it was just a horror. Just full of the kind of torturous, trauma-generating. And then she'd married, and that was awful, and then she had children, and they were all furious at her, partly because she was crazy, that's her word, and it was terrible. She microdosed. Now, one of the things I loved about her is how did she get mushrooms? She said, at night, I snuck into some place and stole them. And that had a certain, kind of certain charm in terms of the underground, so to speak. But anyway, this is her list of changes, verified by her therapists and friends. Improved impulse control, parenthesis, very big for me who was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder just over a year ago. Better mood control, more contentment, no drinking, over a month now. Reduced stress, looking forward to life. This is someone who is suicidal. Making life plans, painting up a storm, increased ability to focus, less reactionary, hardly swearing at all. Parenthesis, I didn't notice this. My friend did, and I'm surprised. Resolving obsessive thoughts eliminated during the day. Lessened at night, not dawn. Increased gratitude. Improved boundaries and able to stand my ground. Increased ability to give myself credit when credit is due. Increased creativity. And other things that are more subtle. People around me are noticing a huge difference. Now, I wrote her because I was really so moved. And she also indicated that she had begun to reconcile with her children. These were adult children who were just furious at her. And then about 6 months later, she indicated her daughter, one of her daughters, was now microdosing and overcoming the trauma of her mothering. So there are now a couple of the capitalist hawks who are figuring out that microdosing may be, the kind of sweet spot for excessive profits. And I just have to, I'm a little negative on that, probably because I'm not a shareholder. I don't know. But the culture is shifting. And the shift is from this being a kind of almost an underground event, if it wasn't in such a, straight venue, with high prices and, parking. But we're moving off of that into the next round in the culture where the medical profession is getting excited because all doctors would like to be able to heal more of their patients more easily. And in the psychiatric profession, where a vast amount of the tools available, the pharmaceuticals aren't very good. So psychedelics are making a huge impact in a very healthy way. And there's a general rule of thumb that anything that can be misused will be. So that will also occur. But that's an introduction to microdosing in the context of being, it's really not part of the psychedelic renaissance, it just happened at the same time. But usually I take credit for being part of the renaissance when I'm with my what I would call my high-dose friends. Because they invite me to places like this. Like tomorrow, right? Everyone else is going to talk about high doses. So that's part of the larger awareness of the transpersonal and the awareness that we need to explore all of consciousness. So that we no longer, at least a room like this, if I said, last week I realized as I was holding an orange that I was an orange. And you would all say, oh, that's really cool. But if I were in a different audience, they would say, oh, really? And are you medicated now? Are you still an orange? So we have expanded what we accept from other people's consciousness in a way that was not true before. And was even in many cases not true in indigenous people, because indigenous people don't really sit around and get high. Mostly psychedelics have been used historically for healing and divination, finding out things that you need to know that you can't find on the physical. The woman who introduced or was discovered by Gordon Wasson, a banker with psychedelics, a woman named Maria Sabina, who had been a healer using mushrooms from ancestor after ancestor. And she said until the gringos came, no one ever asked to see God. They just came for healing, or they'd say, my brother Juan is in a village 50 miles from here. I haven't heard from him in months. Could you see if he's ill? You go to Maria Sabina to get help. So there was a shift from the indigenous uses to ours. Some beneficial, some maybe not. So anyway, that's a lot of what I wanted to share with you. I'd love to have questions. There are some microphones. Now, there are two things about questions. One is, and this is remedial for some of you, a question is a single sentence. It may have a clause or two, but it's a single sentence, and at the end, your voice goes up. Okay? And in this kind of a crowd, it never begins with, during my trip, or I first have to tell you about this part of my trip. It never ends that way. Now, short questions can get good answers. If it's a long question, I'm not going to be able to deal with it. Okay? And everyone will be mad at you. Now, the second problem is I have recently some hearing loss, particularly in the higher registers. That's code for women voices. So I have asked James here, from time to time, I will turn to him and say, what was the question? And he will tell me what the question was, and then I will answer it. So that's another reason for making the questions short, because I have found if you have a long question and you ask someone to help you, they give you a short one. What was the question? Oh, okay. So that's it. We're going to do questions, and then we're going to go out into this fairyland of snow that you all call, the way it always is around here for 4 months a year. But for me, it's like Christmas card land. You know, we only do fires and earthquakes where I come from. We don't do snow very well. Okay, thank you.
Well, first off, Dr. Fadiman, you're awesome. And I just wanted to know what you make about Dr. Andrew Weil's claim about a heroic dose of LSD curing his pigment mutation and allowing him to go in the sun.
Oh, Andrew Weil, who is the foremost alternative physician in America, who is also the person responsible in part for firing Tim and Dick from Harvard. We all have done things that we don't want to talk about when we get older. Is a wonderful, wonderful human being. And he has used psychedelics in several peculiar ways. And I wasn't familiar with that one, but it makes as much sense as shingles. The one that I liked of Andrew is he's, somewhere in college or graduate school, and he has a cat allergy, severe cat allergy. And during a psychedelic session, those of you that know cats will totally understand this. The cat says, ha, 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 there's somebody with a cat allergy. And he's stoned and he can't get away. So he jumps on Andy Weil. And Andy Weil has never had a cat allergy since. The other thing that happened is Andy was doing yoga, and there's a posture where you're going backwards and you want your toes to touch the floor. And he could get within, like somewhere like that, and that was it. And he thought on psychedelics that day he would try that. So he did it, and his toes touched the floor. And he thought, that's terrific. And then the next day, he tried it again, and his toes did not touch the floor. But he knew they could. And within a week or two, he could touch the floor. So there's something about understanding your capacity that you didn't know before. And in terms of not being sensitive to sunlight or burning easily, I honestly don't know. And I believe everything because it makes life easier. And you get to believe really cool stuff. And I figure I was wrong there as if I'm, cynical. But cynical, you don't get any fun out of it. So I don't know. How's that for an answer? Okay, now that we're clear what kind of answer you're happy with, we have more of those.
Hello.
Hello.
I wanted to know if you have any information about microdosing for children with anxiety or other psychological impairments due to trauma.
Microdosing, and you've used a very important word. People who are depressed or depressed and anxious, and often those go together because when you're depressed, you're not getting much done and you get anxious. They do very well on the whole with microdosing. People who only have anxiety, again on the whole, most people do not do well with microdosing. Our theory is, and as you can tell, I don't like theory much, our theory is either you are more anxious or you are more aware of your anxiety. I prefer the awareness one because it fits with a lot of other reports of other kinds of microdosing. So if you went to our website called microdosingpsychedelics.com, if you did that, you would find a couple of little warnings. One is that one about anxiety. One is we have a list of medications that you can or can't take with microdosing, and and also supplements and herbs and things. People have, again, written us. And we have 185 that are okay. And we have lithium that we're not sure about, because we have one report of someone on lithium carbonate. It's a very strong drug for very difficult conditions, who was made worse. So we've put in the warning, and then we went through our records, and we had 3 or 4 other people on lithium who were doing fine. And then my favorite, this is for the geeks in the audience. If you take microdosing and you are red-green colorblind, you will not like it, because you will have, and I can use this word with this audience, tracers. Okay, for a few of you, tracers are when you've had a psychedelic, and here's a light, and as you move the light, you have this tracer kind of following it. You do it with sparklers on July 4th, those where you make a light in the air. But people will have tracers for days, okay, and they don't like it. So we don't recommend that people with red-green color blindness use microdosing. We don't have a lot more. You know, we'd like to have a few more things to say it's bad for you, because in the science world, you have to do that. You know, let me just give you, I gave you one word that I wanted you to reuse. Placebo, don't use it. Natural healing response. The other term is side effects. Okay? There are no side effects. There's only effects. Got it? Side effects is a marketing tool. Here is something that'll lower your cholesterol. We are selling it so you can lower your cholesterol. Oh yeah, it destroys your liver. It's a side effect. It doesn't happen to everybody. So, and when you get something from the pharmacy, there's this, in like 6-point type, there'll be a list of a bunch of horrible side effects, which the manufacturer is forced to mention, but they're not forced to mention all of them. So understand that every pharmaceutical has a lot of effects, and you hope that the effects you're getting it for outweigh the problems. One of the things about microdosing is the kind of risk-benefit ratio of effect to undesirable effects. There's most people who complain about microdosing not being okay basically say nothing happened, which, given the way the world is, that's not so bad. And so what our suggestion is, if nothing happens, up the dose a little bit. If nothing happens, stop. If it's not pleasant or agreeable or beneficial, stop, because you're taking it every couple of days. And so it's kind of self-efficaciously, safe. It's just not dangerous. It's very hard to get in trouble with microdosing. You say, well, what about overdosing? Of course. You ever tried overdosing with this? It'll kill you. Okay? And my favorite one about danger, it's actually about marijuana, but it's such a good visual. If I did PowerPoints, I would have this for you. But imagine there's a chart, and it's things that kill you, and the top bar, which is the longest bar, is tobacco. Like, 400,000 deaths per some million. And then there's alcohol, and you go way down to the bottom, and 2 from the bottom of things that kill you are peanuts. About 100 deaths a year. And below that, you can see why the marijuana people like this chart, is marijuana, 0. Okay? Microdoses seem to be closer to marijuana than to peanuts. And we also have almost no deaths that we can attribute to even higher doses of classic psychedelics. people will, you can, if you take like 50 doses of acid, you know, you forget where the zeros were. You might be incommunicado for like 4 or 5 days, and you'll be in an emergency room. And then you will come out of that and you'll say, I don't remember that much. and your life goes on unimpeded with no known damage. Okay. So don't overdose, but with microdosing, if you underdose, you'll probably still do fine. Because we also have some studies of people who, instead of taking 10 mics, they took 1 mic. And there was a lot of improvements at that level too. So we really don't know what are, you know, a lot about things. Another question, please.
You brought up the benefits of microdosing. You've been highlighting that a lot. My question is what are the benefits of entheogenic or ego-level death experiences at higher doses?
I'm not sure I got the question. Did you get the question?
What are the benefits if you do a very high dose?
Oh, okay. The high dose world, which I was in for decades, never looked at something, is something you can't do very often. Okay? And it's a massive shift in a lot of physical and a lot of mental aspects of yourself. And now there's a word called integration, which is if you just kind of mess with your head and don't integrate, you end up not getting much. So I tend not to say much about high doses because high doses are so controlled by set and setting, by expectation, not much by which psychedelic. The difference between psilocybin and LSD is almost invisible. I'm not sure, was that enough of an answer?
My question is more specifically guarded towards how are there benefits, say the integration process is there, and they've taken enough part for like 6 months to a year, right? How, if the integration process is there, what are the benefits of these high-level entheogenic?
Oh, what are the benefits of high doses? Woo! Tomorrow night's talk. The benefits of high doses, I mean, what I'm going inside and saying, my whole life was transformed on October 19th, 1961 with a high dose. A great many people have not said that was beneficial. My mommy and my daddy. And a couple of my professors at Stanford who wanted to throw me out and allow me the privilege of going to Vietnam as an alternative study ground. So it's a hard question. It's a little bit like saying, what are the benefits of college? Meaning it's a massive shift in a great many things. And the purpose of integration is so that you can make sense of it. I mean, for instance, you have an experience in which it is clear to you that you were neither born nor will die. And that this is a kind of temporary box in which you are in. You know, that you're inside this box. And eventually you'll get a new box. As Ram Dass said in one of his last tapes, birth, death, it's just like that. Well, that's a huge statement about the whole way you hold your whole life. And the question of integration is, how does that fit into your life? Or does it not fit into your life? I think I mentioned, I think it was at dinner actually. One of the things that happens for some people is they realize that they're God. Now, that goes in two directions. One is, if no one else is God, then you have a mission. Okay? If everyone else is God, then that's really just cool. Same internal event, but how do you hold it? Okay, and this is one that is not uncommon. So I can't really deal, it's much too good a question. Okay? And if you read about 30 or 40 books of people's experiences, it won't help. Including mine. Which is that a high dose is a shift in your worldview. And it's a shift that can't be undone. There was a song from World War I. It was about Americans coming from a very provincial world, mainly a rural agricultural world, and going to Europe. And the refrain goes, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? Right? How can you go back to a very small town in Utah or Indiana or Central Valley of California in 1918 and just resume your life when you have been to, to Vienna and to Budapest and to Paris? You can't undo it. Was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? That's too hard a question. So I'm gonna crawl away from your question inadequately, but that's the best I can do. Okay? You guys are like the teacher that says, you got it wrong, but I'm giving you credit for trying. I always like those teachers. Yes.
Hi. First, thank you for the work you're doing. I appreciate it. I think a lot of us do. I would like to know, for those of us who work in the field of mental health and are really stoked about the changes that are happening, the research that is happening, do you have any practical suggestions on how do we help? What are things that we can do to help this movement continue in an efficient and awesome way that I think a lot of us are hoping for?
Kind of how can we help things get better sooner?
How can we get involved? What can we do
how
in
can we
our
get involved?
hands to
Well,
help
there's
this?
a new organization. This is a info commercial for my sponsor. But that's what they're here for. That's why this meeting happened, because a bunch of people put in an amazing amount of work so that you could be here and you could be in a position to now know, one is there's a large community, and two is that there's a lot more people out there that are comfortable with your experience than you thought. I used to call it the engineer on the next bench phenomenon, which is, well, I can't tell anyone at work what I'm really interested in. I said, why don't you just talk to the guy next to you? Wow, the guy next to me is farther out than I am. So what you can do is just be comfortable with your own experiences, share them carefully. When someone is frightened, pull back. And in a sense, be a role model. What you really want is people to come up to you and say, you're really either lovely or you're lovelier or you used to be such a crumb. That's probably the best. What's gone on for you? Now, does that sound like a cosmetics commercial? Well, I'm using Maybelline. I take psychedelic drugs, that's why I'm an person. That's really the answer. But it's to live so that people would want to ask you that. And read and support, buy books from authors that can't sell them otherwise. My book. My book actually sells very well. Don't buy it. It's probably too advanced for a lot of you anyway. We all have to find our own path in what the Dalai Lama calls alleviating suffering. And that's the way I try and figure out whether what I'm doing makes sense or not. If it's alleviating suffering, I'm going to see if I can do it. If it's making me feel good, I still will probably do it, but I'll lie to myself and say it's alleviating suffering. And sometimes there are just some things that we do that are totally worthless, and we know that. And that's okay, because that's part of the whole system. But if you can change the ratio, perhaps, to do a little more that alleviates suffering, and attribute that, if it's true, to some of your psychedelic insights. See, psychedelic insights usually lead to an increased appreciation of nature, an increased willingness to try and save it before we burn it down, kinder to people you don't like, and more loving with people you do. Do that. Okay?
Hi there. I can't believe this hasn't been asked yet, but I would like to know what you recommend for microdosing, how frequently and how much.
Fortunately, I know the answer to that. If you went to microdosingpsychedelics.com, you would find that we recommend a research dose, which is 1 day dosing, 2 days not dosing, 1 day dosing, 2 days not dosing, 1 day dosing, 2 days not dosing. Now that's half of your question. The reason for that is we found that most psychedelics you'll have a 2-day effect. And that extra day is so you come back down and so you can tell the difference. After a month, we say you do whatever your body and you have worked out. For doses, and it depends on the substance, but I'll just use LSD and psilocybin because that's about 85% of the people. LSD, we suggest between 7 and 12 micrograms. We used to say 10, but hundreds of people have said that was too much, so they made it lower. And about one out of 100 would say it was not enough and they'd make it a little higher. So we now have a range. Psilocybin mushrooms, we used to recommend 0.2 grams to 0.5 grams as that range. We now recommend, again, based on hundreds of reports, 0.1 gram to 0.4 grams. Now with mushrooms, there are different species, they have different strengths, and if you take 2 mushrooms of the same species growing next to each other, they also might have different strengths. So it drives the mechanical, scientific, medical model crazy. But in terms of the way you put salt on your eggs, it makes total sense. Which is, I put on some, that's not enough. I put on too much, that's too much. Can you imagine that salt would only come in like, you had to put that much on or double it? So that's the dose range. And if you go to that page, we mentioned some other items, some other substances with dose ranges that people have told us about. So that's it. A microdose, and you'll know that you have the correct dose when at the end of the day you will notice that you were a little nicer, you got a little more done. If you went to the gym, you did 1 more set of reps. You, as one of my wonderful early reports said, he was a junk food guy. He said, I looked at the menu and I wanted the salad. At the end of the day, and you've had such days, you say, gee, that was a really good day. And you forgot you took a microdose. That's the correct dose. Okay. Yep.
I appreciate that question because that was actually my question. So now I just have a sheer curiosity question. Did you have any friendships with Robert Hunter or Jerry Garcia?
Robert who? Oh, Hunter Thompson? Oh, Robert Hunter.
Robert Hunter, Jerry Garcia from the Grateful Dead.
Who's Robert Hunter? The Dead, sorry. The Dead.
The Dead.
We're both from Menlo Park. We both knew Kesey. And they were very successful. No, during the time when they were becoming, when they were not making a living teaching guitar lessons in the local music shop and being an unknown band, they were sponsored by one of the great LSD chemists who sold, this is something about the LSD community that the new commercial community will not understand. But Bear, as his nickname was, would make a batch of LSD, and he made LSD really better quality than Sandoz. But he went to Berkeley and learned how to do it by reading manuals. He would divide it in half, and he would have half to give away in the community, such as to dead concerts and things, and half he would sell at a small price. And or other people would sell, and he was asked about that, and he said, by giving away half, I keep the price on this half low. Just marketing. So the Dead were this band surrounded by a mall of vendors who supplied the nation with psychedelics for a number of years as they went from place to place. And I didn't know them. But I got a lot of mileage out of not knowing them for that answer. So this is it. Thank you very much. Good night. Drive safe.